As Will alluded to, I came up with this title a couple of months ago, 2 months ago, when Trudy needed the title, and obviously things have changed, so we would probably look at changing it to probably more like $7 corn is what it's looking like here in the near future. So that being said, I'm going to do just a little brief background of kind of what the current situation is looking forward. Hopefully my numbers match up with Steve Meyer's here in another hour. They should, because some of this information I've gotten from Steve, but you know, it looks like when you look at a number of different projections that we're looking at somewhere around $60 per hundredweight live as being the kind of the average for this upcoming year for hog prices. This is a pretty significant increase from this past year, about 7% over what the average was for 2010. Production costs, however, we see are going to be running probably at least that $60 per hundredweight, or potentially higher as we see some of the projections for grain prices coming out. So, you know, this is based on $6.50 to $7 corn. The issue here is that's about an 85% increase from the average corn price that we had here in 2010. So obviously an 85% increase trumps the 7% increase that we're going to see in hog prices. I apologize, that's old line down there, but what we're looking at in the near future here is potentially looking at around a break even, or perhaps a slight profit or slight loss. What I'm not going to cover here is risk management strategies, but I think it's pretty apparent that that's one of the really key things for producers here moving forward in this volatile type market, is how do you protect yourself from these types of significant increases in input prices, or also potential significant decreases in hog prices. Here's a chart. Steve Meyer actually put it together, but it shows some actual and predicted hog production costs and prices based on Iowa State model. And as you can see, in 2010, the forecast or the estimate was that producers on average made right around $10 a head on hogs. But in 2011, particularly as we get to the end of 2011, when we're going to potentially see a drop in hog prices, we're going to see perhaps right around break even, perhaps a slight profit, but certainly nothing near the situation that we've had this past year. So the situation looks kind of bleak as we look out this next year, particularly in the next in 6 to 9 months from now. So what do we do? Well, one thing I think we need to recall is that farmers are resourceful. They will take advantage of what they've got currently and try to come up with a solution. Sometimes the solution may not always seem to be the safest or maybe the most prudent, but maybe it gets the job done. Other times, maybe it doesn't look pretty, but you're going to maximize the value out of what you have available to you. All joking aside, though, some things that we can do is try to reassess our goals for our operation and reassess our different areas throughout the system to ensure that we're going to maximize our return for our investment, and particularly our return on feed cost for the pork that we produce. Understand an important key point here, particularly when we're talking about high feed prices in comparison to hog prices, is that we're trying to maximize or optimize that return. That does not necessarily mean that we're trying to maximize performance. A key differentiation there. And so this is where records come into play. You need to evaluate your current production levels. You need to try to evaluate different scenarios and see where it makes sense based on your feed costs and feed formulation and estimated performance, where you should be feeding these animals, and what makes most economic sense. Different ways we can maximize return. We need to look at, certainly if we can, decreasing the cost of production and or increasing revenue that we're getting from our production. But again, we're looking for a mix of that helps us optimize our returns. So again, looking at feed and other production costs, but then also evaluating our pig performance and our carcass value, and how we do changes within the system and how it affects these three is going to be really key. Some different areas that we really need to look at and evaluate would include our genetics, where you're at genetically, and how you compare not only to the industry, but also how the rest of your system applies and fits with your genetics. Animal health is going to be very key. We're going to look at diets and feeding management, and then we also need to assess our environment and also our marketing, making sure that we're doing a good job in all of these areas. So we look more specifically at that genetic merit. Understand that genetics are what drive what's possible. Not necessarily what we achieve on the farm, but what would be possible for performance, be it growth performance or reproductive performance. Also, certainly, of course, we generally figure that if we have a decrease in performance, that's going to increase our cost per pig, because we're getting less productive value out of that pig for what we're putting into it. So, and as we've certainly gone, and the trend has been for many years here, we keep increasing our market weight. We keep looking at having extremely lean pigs, later maturing hogs. And so, if you look at different data, and it could be data looking across different genetic lines, it could be data across individuals within genetic lines, understand that there's going to be quite amount of variation that you can see between different individuals or different genetic lines. Sometimes we tend to fall into this thought process of all pigs kind of being the same. They're all going to perform the same, and as much as we try to minimize variation at times, there certainly is a fair amount of variation. And that being said, if we aren't measuring and we aren't aware of where we're at lean gain per day, we really can't guess. We don't have an idea of where we stand on this chart. A big issue with this and trying to maximize lean accretion or lean growth per day is the fact that when you look at lean tissue compared to fatty tissue, lean tissue is about 2/3 to 3/4 water, compared to fatty tissue, which is maybe 10% water. It's a lot more efficient to put on water weight than it is to put on weight, be it from lipid or protein. So that's where you really pick up some efficiencies and some improved value is if you can increase lean growth as compared to more fatty type growth. Also, again, kind of going back to genetics 101 here, realizing, understanding that when we are trying to improve and maximize our genetics, we want to be maximizing heterosis as much as possible, but when we're doing that, also realizing that heritability, we can really affect those traits that are influenced by growth and carcass type traits, whereas we're going to have a much slower effect on proving reproductive traits. Okay, so moving on to animal health. Certainly we know animal health is important. We don't want to have animals getting sick. That certainly costs us a lot of money, but oftentimes disease that affects our bottom line, it might be more a subclinical type disease versus clinical, where we can see. Subclinical diseases such as ileitis, some of these other types of digestive type diseases particularly, can really have an impact on your bottom line, and if you aren't keeping good records, aren't tracking growth rate compared to what you would expect for your group, you might not be able to pick up on some of these issues. Certainly when pigs reduce their feed intake, one of the side effects, the negative side effects, would be that a greater proportion of those nutrients that the pig is consuming yet are going to now be going more to maintenance and less to growth. So as feed intake decreases, generally you're going to say that feed efficiency gets poorer. Also, when an animal's under a subclinical disease situation, although you may not be able to observe signs of disease, understanding that immune system of that pig is being activated. And that activation takes energy and takes nutrients away from what would otherwise be productive value. Here's a study that was done in North Carolina State, actually a few years back, but I think it really highlights well what kind of results on performance we see with pigs that are under disease situations or just situations where their immune systems have been activated. As you'll note here, we'll see a decrease in feed intake, but actually a more pronounced decrease in growth performance, certainly a reduction in feed conversion. When you look at the carcass itself, pigs actually will tend to increase their amount of fat deposition in comparison to lean, so certainly that's not a positive. And so certainly have a lot of negative effects there of activating the immune system. So what kind of things can we do? A big thing, of course, is prevention of disease. Just to review some things that if you've gone through PQA Plus, they do a really nice job of highlighting, but looking at biosecurity and being very strict and consistent with that biosecurity. Be it use of clothing or boots, or if you're doing shower in, shower out, controlling activity of rodents, birds, other animals, controlling traffic between barns and certainly across different farms, minimizing vehicle traffic. All these things are really key. I think, certainly almost nearly all of our production now we use all-in, all-out production, but that's really key and important to breaking that disease cycle, making sure that we do a good job of cleaning and disinfecting between those groups. Then we also want to make sure we can do anything else we can to minimize stress on the pigs. If we've got improper diets or we've got anything improper in the environment, that's going to stress the pigs, and that activates the immune system. Certainly if we don't use good animal handling techniques, that'll stress the animal. So one of the key things here, the tendency is when we have economic situations where it's at, is to cut costs. So maybe one of the things you would think is, well, the vet doesn't need to come out this quarter. No, that's actually probably the opposite of what you need to be doing. You got to make sure your health plan is up to date. So make sure you're consulting with the veterinarian, understanding what your current health status is, and what you should be doing from vaccination treatment standpoint, making sure that the products that you're using, the health products, are appropriate and are needed for what your current health status is in your herd. Also an important key here that people maybe don't think about as much is that you need to make sure that you establish and enforce a good euthanasia program. Well, how does this result to your bottom line? Well, the tendency is for producers not to euthanize as many pigs as they probably should. Being livestock producers, you naturally want to make those animals get better, care for them, but oftentimes we're caring for pigs that will never fully recover. And so in those times, you need to consider if it makes sense to euthanize those pigs. Poor-doing pigs tend to consume disproportionate amounts of feed in comparison to the amount of gain that they actually have. So they're certainly very inefficient in gain. Also, certainly you'll have the extra expense of medications typically with those animals compared to your normal stock. And then you've got the typhoid Mary effect, where those pigs tend to harbor some diseases that can keep a subclinical level of disease within the herd. So we need to try to make sure we control that. And part of it also is making sure we're doing a good job observation-wise, walking through those pens day-to-day basis, catching those pigs that may just be starting to not feel quite 100%, and taking quick and accurate treatment immediately. Okay, moving on to our feeding program. Here is an opportunity or an area where you can potentially help yourself out quite a bit, both from a a cost standpoint, and also potentially on a improvement of revenue standpoint. Going back to Nutrition 101 here, understanding that pigs need nutrients in amounts per day. And we always are talking about what's the percent lysine in the diet, what's the percent or the density of energy in the diet. But we kind of tend to forget the other half of that equation, which is feed intake. Both of those are key because that ultimately determines what's the amount of that nutrient the pig gets per day, and that's really what we're targeting and what we need to be aware of. So if you have situations, be it seasonal or disease situations or whatever, that affect the feed intake, really that should be affecting our concentration in the diet also to ensure that we're still meeting those pigs' nutritional needs. How do we determine what the pig's needs are? Well, we need to know what that lean growth is, that lean growth level in those pigs. So don't just think that I've got high lean pigs, so it must be about this many grams per day. No, you need to measure that. You can estimate it pretty well just based on your carcass and packer data, and then estimating what your incoming weight is on those pigs, and you can estimate what the lean body protein level is in those pigs, and do that estimate. We've actually got the new National Swine Nutrition Guide. There's a software with that has a nutrient estimator. Big part of that is you can just input your carcass data in there and your estimated starting weight, and you can come up with an estimate of lean growth right there. The key is, however way you come about finding it, that you do get that measurement and that you track that. You don't just take the measurement once and then just assume that, okay, that's the growth level that we're at. You need to check it periodically. A lot of producers will base their feeding programs on information that they've got from their genetic supplier. Understand that particularly nutrient recommendations and expected growth rates from genetic suppliers are really more like what is the potential, okay? And if you're doing everything right on the farm, you've got excellent health, then you might be able to reach that potential. But in a lot of farms, we have something else in the environment, or maybe it's with our diets or feeding program, that will limit performance of those pigs to where it's not actually at that level provided by the supplier. So that supplier, we need to review that number as our goal in some ways, or as our benchmark of what is possible. But we need to actually measure on the farm what we currently have, and then use that to evaluate our feeding programs and see if we're correctly meeting nutrient needs, if we're overfeeding or underfeeding nutrients, and where we need to go to from there. A couple basic things here I'm sure you've run across and seen before. Phase feeding. Basically, the goal here is to try to minimize the amount of nutrients that we're over or underfeeding. So we're going to be feeding multiple diets throughout the lifetime of that pig. If we look at an example here, we're going to have 2 diets in the grow-finish period, 1 grower, 1 finisher diet. There's quite a bit of area here that is above the line, which is the actual nutrient requirement for the pig. Everything above that line would indicate excess nutrients that we're providing in the diet. And more times than not, that generally means we're spending more on the diet than we necessarily need to. By increasing the number of phases, then of course what we're trying to do, and what we do end up doing, is minimizing that area above that line, and therefore minimize the amount of nutrients that we're oversupplying, ultimately trying to meet that pig's nutrients requirements throughout the lifetime without overly excessively providing nutrients. The challenge here is that not all pigs are equal, and so we do need to account for some variation within our groups of pigs. We need to account for a safety margin, and so we do need to provide a slightly higher level of nutrients than what would be kind of the baseline requirements for those pigs. But again, this just underlies the importance of phase feeding. Now, how many phases do you use? That's a good question. We generally look at doing that from a standpoint of how much does our bins hold for feed, and that can be a good route. The one challenge is the more phases that we have, the more management that's involved keeping track of those, and also understand that there's an inherent amount of variability in mixing equipment, ingredients themselves, and so to a certain point we will always have some variation no matter how much we try to control it. Now, what surprises me some is that we still have a lot of people that aren't split sex feeding. It might be because it's a challenge in those barns, or it's extra time spent to split the sexes of those pigs. I know some people like having mixed sex pens because when you go to load those pens out, you start pulling the barrels out and you've got some more room for the gilts in there to catch up. But understand, we still have a significant difference between barrels and gilts. From a growth performance standpoint, those barrels are certainly going to eat more, and they're going to grow more faster, and they're going to reach their mature body weight quicker. But those gilts are the ones that are going to be more efficient and more lean. And thus, just thinking about the differences in accretion of lean versus fat tissue and related to lean tissue accretion and growth rate, they're significantly different. And I think you're, particularly in times of here when margins are tight, you're missing some opportunities to capture some extra value by split sex feeding, and thus having two separate lines, one for barrels, one for gilts, and not either overfeeding barrels or underfeeding gilts at any given time. Feed budgeting. We all talk about it, we implement it, but how many times do we actually check to see if our feed budgets are what is occurring in the barn? Periodically, we need to be checking on, okay, when we're changing these diets, is the average pig weight at the weight that we expect it to be for, or that we plan for in that feed budget? Okay, is that pig weight correct? Any slight changes in feed intake in those pigs, or growth rate, is going to change that to where our budget can get thrown off fairly quickly. So we need to be checking those feed budgets periodically to make sure that what we have on paper matches what's going on in the barn. Alternative ingredients. Certainly when we have corn or any other of our main ingredients increase in price, first thing we want to do, and our tendency to do, is say, okay, what else can I look at feeding? And it is something that we definitely need to do. That being said, we need to keep some things in mind. Again, go back to the idea that we're providing nutrients. And so, no, we don't have to feed corn to our pigs. We can feed pigs other ingredients and they can still get all the nutrients that they need. Also understand that as we're providing those nutrients, energy is going to be the most costly nutrient that we're providing on a total basis, followed by our protein and amino acids, and then you look at phosphorus and some of our other minerals. So the next thing is a really key point here. We need to make sure that we're using correct formulation techniques and that we're using digestible nutrient levels when we're evaluating these alternatives and formulating them in diets. We've been able to get away oftentimes with just plain corn soybean meal diets looking at total levels, but when we look at alternative ingredients, there can be significant differences in digestibility, and ultimately what we're trying to establish is how do we get about that nutrient level that the pig can actually utilize and will incorporate for maintenance or for production. Also kind of think down the road a little bit. There might be a great buy on something at one given time, but is it a consistent supply? Is it something that we can kind of rely on and kind of incorporate into the future? And that really gets down to your goals. Are you willing to be switching ingredients in and out, or are you looking for something more consistent? Because there are going to be some ingredients that for brief periods of time are available and or at a good price, but will not necessarily remain that way. Then, of course, make sure there aren't any other factors that would negatively impact feed intake, growth, carcass value, things such as mycotoxins, foreign debris, those kinds of items. So there's a lot of different things we can look at. We can look at other grain sources. We can look at co-products. And of course, the big thing that we are looking at, and then a lot of people are feeding in this area, would be the distillers' dried grains. That is the co-product from the ethanol plants. We've got a lot of distillers' grains. As more and more corn is being utilized in ethanol plants, we're having a lot more distillers grains being available. And certainly in the recent past, they have priced very favorably on a nutritional standpoint in comparison to corn. And even though the amino acid profile is not ideal, we can still replace some of the soybean meal and do it in a very economical fashion. We're still not the livestock group that utilizes distillers grains the best. When you look at it from a dollars and cents standpoint, distillers grains really fits in nicely in beef and dairy rations. But at current prices right now, you can have some substantial savings also including it in swine and poultry rations. Some things that we need to keep in mind, and these aren't necessarily just concerns on distillers, but this would be really in general for any kind of co-product you might be evaluating. What are those nutrient levels? How variable can the nutrient levels be? Do we have some potential issues for mycotoxins? This is a concern every fall is okay, are we seeing mycotoxins in the field, and therefore are we going to see mycotoxin problems in the distillers? Understand that mycotoxins, if we've got a certain mycotoxin level in corn that's going into the plant, we're essentially going to triple that concentration of that mycotoxin in the distiller's product that's remaining. Flowability and handling, if based on the source that we're getting, are we having some negative impacts on flowability and handling, or is it a product that works in our system very well? Some past research that we've looked at that would indicate you could certainly include 10 to 20% distillers without having any appreciable effect on performance in grow-finish pigs. You can go 30-40% in gestating sow diets fairly well also without having any impact on performance, and 10 to 20%. That being said, a lot of people are pushing the limit and going higher than these levels, and certainly not saying that you can't go higher, but understand that as we push the limit, as we go to 30 or 40% in grow-finish diets, for instance, we could have some potential negative impacts. One concern is going to be carcass quality. As we increase the level of distillers grains, what we're essentially doing is increasing the level of corn oil in the diet. We end up with a much more unsaturated fat source, and it results in softer fat, be it belly fat, back fat, and so this can cause some issues from a quality standpoint. It can cause some issues from a processing standpoint for the packer, and so that's something we need to continually evaluate and look at. Also, certainly when you get up to 30-40%, we probably start seeing some slight decreases in performance of those pigs. But that doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. We need to evaluate that compared to what we're saving and see if we're maximizing return. Yes?
As we push 40% on sow diets, gestation diets, is there anything else besides the vitamin E, selenium thing that's going to creep up?
Good question. We really haven't seen too much for other issues. The one thing is when you're first starting these sows, you can have some palatability issues. But once you get them accustomed to the distillers and the diets, from most things I've heard out in the field, producers have been very happy. They've been feeding that 40%. Some people have gone up to 60% distillers, quite high. But yes, there is that one item you need to think about: vitamin E, selenium levels, potential for mulberry heart disease, and that's where when you're pushing these levels, you really need to make sure you're working with a nutritionist to ensure that all your other nutrient specs are in line and will work with that. We even have some research that would suggest that if we're going into these higher levels of distillers in the sow diets, we might actually be seeing an improvement in litter size in subsequent reproductive cycles. We're adding some fiber in the diet when we're feeding those distillers grains. And there has been some past research with other fiber sources that would indicate an improvement in litter size. And some preliminary research that we've done here at the university would also indicate that we might be seeing an improvement in litter size a second and third subsequent reproductive cycle. That being said, whatever your level is you have in gestation sow diets, our suggestion would be that you keep some distillers in there, but you probably cut the level down to about half of what you have in the gestation sow diet. And then That way the sows remain accustomed to that distiller's grains, and they appear to do quite well performance-wise during the lactation period. Everything really gets down to economics, and so certainly that's the big deal, and that's going to base a lot of your decisions on whether or how much distillers to include in the diet. You need to look at your current inclusion levels and what your substitution levels would be. Here's just an example. If I was going to put 10% distillers in the diet of a corn-soy diet, in this example, what is that opportunity cost? If you do the calculations based on how much corn, soybean meal, and dical or monocal phosphorus source that you're going to replace, because distillers grains is also an excellent source of available phosphorus. In this scenario, based on $6.30 corn, $360 per ton soybean meal, and then as you can see with these calculations, what you end up figuring out that is that you could pay up to $250 a ton for distiller's grain. Well, at the current market, say at $180 per ton, that savings can be quite substantial. You're looking at around $7.50 per ton. So if we were to go up to 20%, you're looking at $15 per ton savings, and where you're really expecting to have a minimal or no impact negatively on revenue. So that should be pretty much a pure improvement in profitability. Some producers have noticed a slight decrease in carcass yield. But that's been quite variable. We see it with some producers, not in other cases. That might be an issue of correct formulation of those diets, whether or not the animals are actually getting the correct amount of amino acids or not. Some other things that we need to evaluate and consider: growth promotants. The idea here, of course, is that we're going to get more out of what we're feeding from a nutrient standpoint, trying to improve the efficiency of utilization. Certainly antibiotics, when you look at the young pig, and particularly in conditions that maybe are less than ideal, you'll see some improvements, maybe 5 to 10% improvement in growth rate, about half of that in improvement in feed conversion. But there's other products out there, and certainly as you walk the trade floor, you're going to see a lot of different alternative type products, be they prebiotics, direct-fed microbials, botanicals, diet acidifiers, different enzymes that may make some sense and hold some value in improving the efficiency of utilization of nutrients, which, when we're looking at high feed costs, can provide a substantial return. The big thing, I think, is when you're trying to evaluate those, try to see what's there for research. Often that's kind of our concern, or our not concern necessarily, but it's kind of an issue that we have, is just that we'd like to see more research. Some of these products are fairly new coming out on the market, and trying to understand how consistent that response might be. But there's a lot of potential there. An item that's been used quite a bit the last several years would be ractopamine. And again, realizing that that's going to increase lean growth, utilized at the end of the finishing period. If we're going to use it, typical inclusion rate might be the last 4 weeks, 3-4 weeks of finishing at about a 4.5 gram level. What we're going to do here is improve feed conversion and growth by about a 10 to 15% level, and so it can be pretty easy to do the economics there, do a partial budgeting, and see how much value that can potentially provide you to include that at the end of the finishing period. Some other things we can look at from a feeding management standpoint. Now might be a time to consider pelleting. When feed costs are relatively cheap, certainly up in this area, it really doesn't make sense to pellet diets unless it's those really early diets where you've got some extremely expensive ingredients and you're trying to minimize feed wastage. But when we've got higher feed costs throughout the production period, we need to compare that cost of getting the diets pelleted pelleted to the improvement we can see in feed conversion, which is ultimately the result of less feed wastage. We also tend to see a slight improvement in energy utilization sometimes in these kind of products. So again, that's something that you should evaluate, look at in your situation, see if it makes sense. For those that have on-farm feed manufacturing facilities, or you're considering that, certainly understand that from a cost standpoint, you can have some cost savings there by doing the mixing of the feed yourself. But on the flip side of that, you're undertaking a lot more issues from a management standpoint. You need to make sure you're maintaining that equipment. You need to take into account the energy usage you're going to have, the time, the labor that's involved. But probably utmost is the amount of management that's involved in making sure that you've got a good quality control system in place. Quality control would be looking at things such as nutrient specs, nutrient levels, both in ingredients and the final feeds. Are they matching what they're supposed to be or what we're assuming on paper? Also, do we have presence of other items such as mycotoxins? And another thing would be to again, it doesn't matter whether you're producing the feed yourself or you're having it commercially produced. You need to be evaluating particle size from time to time. Okay. Typically, or traditionally, we've suggested somewhere around 650 to 750 microns as being the size you should target. In times of high feed costs such as this, we need to examine the potential of decreasing that perhaps some more. Okay. We're generally looking at improvement about 1 to 1.5% in feed conversion rate for every 100 microns that we decrease. And so you might want to start evaluating decreasing that some, keeping in mind that the potential negative is increase in gastric ulcers. So you certainly don't want to increase it significantly right away. You want to decrease it some, evaluating how the pigs are doing. And if you're not having any health issues related to gastric ulcers, perhaps that's a good level, or perhaps you even want to consider lowering it some more. But that's another area that we can look at to try to squeeze a little bit more utilization of the nutrients in the feeds that we're providing. Certainly need to do a good job with feeder management. Kansas State's got some really nice pictures demonstrating what proper feed management should be, and I think anybody that got working in the barns, it's a really good training tool, something that they should have around available to view and to remind themselves what the feeders should look like. This is not a situation we want to see in a feeder trough. We're going to get a lot of feed wastage here. We're generally looking at about 1/2 or maybe a little over half of the feeder trough being covered when we've got young pigs that we're starting out. But after that, you really want to have 1/2 or maybe 1/3 of the feed trough covered. Some people prefer even more like 1/4 of the feed trough covered. So you're looking at something more like this situation of what the feeder setting should be. Or if you're in the situation of a wet-dry type feeder, this is kind of what that should be looking like if you've got the right setting. So, and like with all these other things, you set it, but then you periodically check it because those settings can change. Pigs can move things around. So it's kind of a constant thing you need to be checking and be aware of. Just a little bit on ingredient purchasing. If you are mixing your own feeds, it's generally a decreased cost the more volume you can buy. So whether it means does it make sense to have some extra bins up to store more ingredient, or perhaps do some shared purchasing with other producers, maybe in a cooperative type of a setup, you might be able to decrease some of your input costs that way from an ingredient standpoint. Then, of course, finishing up, we want to make sure that our environment is suitable. We can lose a lot of potential revenue or increase our costs pretty quickly if we aren't properly managing our environment. Look at the ventilation system. The vast majority of our heat loss in swine facilities, which is a pretty big deal this time of the year, will happen due to the ventilation system. So we need to make sure we're monitoring, we're correctly setting those ventilation systems so that we're still removing moisture and noxious gases out of the barn, but we aren't excessively removing that to the point where we're wasting energy. And a big thing also is temperature control. I still tend to see in a lot of barns, particularly with younger pigs, the temperature tends to be on the high side, and so we're spending extra money on propane, on heating those barns, where we could drop the temp slightly and still be in good shape. We're looking at environmentally trying to meet that pig's ideal comfort zone. It's going to obviously depend on the size of the pig and situation, but if we're in that thermal zone, you've got your maximal growth performance, you've got your best feed conversion levels, and you see where your feed take is relatively consistent through that. But as we go to temperatures that are too hot, feed intake starts to decrease. That reduces the amount of nutrients for growth, so obviously we see a reduction in growth, and thus the growth that does occur is much less efficient. Opposite end, if those pigs are too cold, and we need to be aware of that and be concerned with that also, because that's more costly for us in situations with high feed costs. We're going to have pigs start increasing feed intake in an attempt to increase their heat production. They'll do that to a point, and then if they're too cold, we'll start seeing a reduction in growth rate, and a result of all of that, of course, is a decrease in feed conversion. Here's some work done at Iowa State by Jay Harmon, looking at just a comparison of how much 2 degrees in a nursery barn can make on energy usage. And in this example, it was $1.48 per gallon propane, and decreasing the temperature from 78 degrees down to 76 degrees, which was still in that pig's comfort zone. In a 1,000-head nursery, you can see the savings there dropped annual cost from $1,700 down to about $1,400.50. And that's just with 2 degrees. If we're running heat high, I'm guessing a lot of barns are perhaps 3 or 4 degrees higher than maybe they need to be. You can start seeing significant differences there, and this is just using a 1,000-head nursery as an example. I'm going to finish up with marketing. Just a couple of remarks here. We need to be continually evaluating where it makes the most sense for us to be selling our pigs, where we're going to have our contracts at, and then we need to make sure that we're marketing our pigs at that correct weight, keeping in mind not only the packer grid, but keeping in mind that, okay, if I want to increase my average weight another 2 pounds, what's that extra added cost compared to what I'm going to get for revenue? In times of feed costs, it might not make sense. It oftentimes will not make sense here to increase your marketing weight to the top of that packer's ideal grid weight versus the bottom. Again, you need to look at your records, crunch those numbers, and determine that on an individual basis. But when we have relatively inexpensive corn and inexpensive feed, it's pretty much a no-brainer position. We tend to try to hit the top of that packer grid to maximize revenue. Times of high feed cost, that's not necessarily the case. We need to make sure that we're evaluating that. And this just shows that, just the differences that you can see between different genetic lines on the efficiency and the cost of adding extra weight. And this is an older study back when they did the genetic evaluations, but looking at increasing from 250 to 290 pounds. What was the cost of that compared to the additional revenue? And you can see in this situation where feed cost is low, we have a couple of situations here where it didn't make sense to add weight onto those pigs. But in the majority of situations, you did have increased revenue compared to that. However, when we have high feed costs, which would be top of the yellow here, relative to hog revenue, then we had essentially all but one of these genetic lines where it did not make sense to add value. So in other words, there was one genetic line here that, be it the leanness and the lean growth level of that animal, and obviously efficiency of that growth, that one line, it did still make sense to add that weight, but all the other lines in that high feed cost situation, it didn't make sense. This is just kind of an example. Again, we can see this kind of variation in individual farms, and this is why you need to look at your own data, evaluate that, and then see where's that ideal marketing weight that we should be hitting. Also, when you're marketing pigs, consider feed withdrawal if possible. Feed withdrawal is simply removing feed from those pigs for approximately 12 hours. It could be upwards of 16, 18 hours, but you really want to make sure pigs aren't off feed any more than 18 hours, otherwise you might see some cartridge shrink and issues there. We are not removing water. That's a very key point to make here. So if we're removing the feed, we need to make sure that water is still available for those pigs. But if we do that, we've got a couple of different advantages. Of course, we're not spending the extra money on the feed that pig would be consuming those last 12 hours. But also, those pigs are going to actually move easier and have less stress. And we also are finding out that we can see some improvements in pork quality and also in safety of the pork, simply because the contamination risk when those animals are being processed is less because they have an empty belly. And the truckers like it because there's less of a mess to clean up on the trailer, of course. But so here's an area where you've got an opportunity to save some dollars. Some facilities, some pens are set up where it would be difficult to do that. And one item I want to emphasize here is that we are not removing feed from pigs if some of the pigs in that pen are going to remain. We do not want to have any out-of-feed events for pigs that are not being sold, because that can have a lot of detrimental effects. What we want to do is, ideally, if you've got a pen set up, and if you can separate a third or a fourth of that pen and provide a water source there, you can sort the pigs the night before you're gonna sell them. Move the pigs up there. It certainly makes loading quite easy in the morning, but also that gives you the opportunity to do this feed withdrawal and perhaps save a few dollars in the process. So, again, just a summary. There's a lot of things to look at here. I don't have any, magic bullets here of wisdom to tell you. It again is going back and analyzing what we're doing, which I know many of you have been doing quite a bit the last 10 years. But again, it's a continual process. We need to continue to evaluate and look for some of these opportunities where we might be able to provide either some extra value or reduce some costs that would ultimately improve our profitability over the long term. Again, sometimes some things make sense short term, but maybe they don't make sense in the long term. So evaluate the system in its entirety.